Bonsoir à toutes et tous. Je suis Francesco Garuti, directeur associé de programme au CCA, et je suis très heureux de vous présenter ce soir une soirée dédiée au vernissage de l'exposition et du projet de film de l'artiste Joyce Joumaa, L'inertie du vide, To Remain and Then No Longer, كيف لا نغرق في السراب, réalisé dans le cadre du programme de résidence pour commissaires émergents du CCA. Before getting started, I'd love to remark that CCA is in the process of developing a long-term and in-depth land acknowledgement in collaboration with members of the Ganayegeaga Nation. We also recognize the many nations who are the original inhabitants and caretakers of these lands and waters, which is now home of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The CCA is a settler institution, and we are working towards fostering affirmative relationship with Indigenous and other people across the Yoayagai, Munyang, Montreal. The first phase of this process was released in February 2022, a biennial fellowship for Indigenous researchers working on land restitution. Artist Angel Loft is the inaugural research fellow, and our project is now on view in the public spaces around the CCA for the rest of the year. So I hope you had a moment to experience it. If not, we encourage you to look for it and immerse yourself into the reading and the listening of the pieces here at CCA. This fellowship is one part of a much larger commitment to creating a living land acknowledgement that will provide long-term support and resources to Indigenous communities and researchers. So the project tonight marks the 9th edition of the Emerging Curator Residency Program, a program established by the CCA to allow new emerging voices from different geographies and coming from different disciplines to propose questions and projects able to challenge the current definition and understanding of built environment. Since 2011, we had architecture historians, art and architecture curators, but also anthropologists and different kind of forms of design practitioners developing with us projects not only able to investigate the mutual relationship between architecture and society, but actually able to push the boundaries of what it means today, curatorial practice. Each project has been structured with a precise format to display every time a different position, from the exhibition to specific installations, from walking tours in different cities in the world to podcast series, video reenactment of academic debates, workshops in rural areas, books, and various forms of editorial initiatives. Tonight, we present you an exhibition and a documentary film conceived and directed by our current emerging curator, Joyce Joumaa. Joumaa is a video artist currently based in Montreal. She grew up in Tripoli, Lebanon, before moving to Montreal in 2016. Her work centers around dissecting the political landscape in Lebanon while referring to a combination of fiction and documentary as her main medium. I have to say that this project for the CCA is of great value for two main reasons, among many. The first one is that somehow To Remain and No Longer is now part of an ongoing series of research, investigations, and studies produced by the CCA, which are actually using cinema as a tool to explore the world around us. For several years now, we have been interested in the use of film as a curatorial tool, as a means to approach the object of study and its environment, to uncover the complexities that condition its being and becoming, to take the pulse of multiple perspectives that shape reality, and to develop a position on it. But of course, To Remain and No Longer is not only a project and the double curatorial format, exhibition and film. Displayed in our octagonal gallery tonight, the exhibition and the film explore the construction, the abandonment, and the attempts of reappropriation of one of the largest fairground projects conceived in the Arab world during, the last century. By examining the precarity of the site designed by the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer that remains to this day, the film reflects on the country's current socio-economic crisis and as it is typical for our project at the CCA, the building is actually an entry point to explore the forces that shape how we design space. The study of the building opens up a discussion about its physical and conceptual margins. How can we use architecture to understand societal transformation? In which way architecture itself has agency on our life? How has architecture been instrumentalized in the ongoing construction of a national narrative? And more. What is the role of the architects in shaping society within corrupt ecologies of power and failed financial engineering? Joumaa's work displays stories and fragments of life, happening along the margins, around and behind the failed monumentality of the site. So before leaving the stage to Joyce and CCA Director Giovanna Borasi and myself for a short conversation about the project, please allow me to thank all the CCA teams who have been working hard to make this project possible. Studio Safar, who has been designing the entire identity of the project, and of course, Joyce, for all the dialogues and conversation during your period of residency here at CCA, and for the incredible passion and dedication that you're granted to this fascinating exploration. I mean, on behalf of the CCA, we can say we will miss you, Joyce. En terminant, le CCA tient à remercier de leur appui généreux les ministres de la Culture et des Communications du Québec, le Conseil des Arts du Canada, Patrimoine canadien, et le Conseil des Arts de Montréal. So I think I've been already talking too much, so please join me welcoming on stage Joyce Joumaa and CCA Director Giovanna Borasi.
So when I first applied, or when I was first looking up the open call text for the emerging curator residency program, I think that the term that caught my attention the most was experimental proposals. And so with this, I decided to move forward with submitting a film proposal, even if the title of the residency goes under emerging curator, because I told myself it is a research institution, but at the same time, it considers itself to be a museum. And I thought that this is the aspect of the definition that I wanted to engage with. And that's how I acknowledged my position since the first interview as a filmmaker. And I think that what's interesting about this emerging curator residency program is that it's such a collaborative experience where the artist or the curator is constantly moving between the many departments that the CCA has, from publication to programs, and is constantly engaging in conversations and the exchange of ideas while making this project. And I feel that in this sense, it really encapsulates the concept of dialogue. Like you really enter a constant dialogue in the making of this project. We can also talk about the film.
Yeah, you can tell us how things started. Yeah.
Yes. I grew up in Tripoli, and I constantly arbitrated as a local resident around the site. And I think that with this grew a feeling of alienation, I would say, towards the site, because it was never really open to the public, or they would, let's say, curate the access that people would have to the site. And being where I am right now as a video artist and filmmaker, I started being interested in opening up more about this feeling of alienation that grew with me. And so I was also, just before I leave Lebanon, things were starting to not go so well, starting with the garbage crisis in 2015. And then the municipal elections in Beirut in 2016 that a lot of people thought was going to lead for change. And then the 2019 revolution, I would say. And they all didn't really end up leading to that, the change that we were looking forward to have. And then at the same time, I was still in Tripoli, and the site was constantly in front of my eyes. And this is where I really started becoming interested in tackling failure as both a concept, as a reality, as something that we've been navigating or I've been subject to. And I think this is where the motifs behind wanting to make the film started. It's with this phenomenon of looking at failure and how failure has been a constant, let's say, cycle in the recent history of Lebanon. And this is where I started feeling like that this site, in the way that it failed as a project, since it was conceived, could be, let's say, an entry point to talk about these many socio-political realities that we've been going through. Yeah.
So maybe thanks Joyce for sharing all this, but maybe I would like to backtrack because I'm not sure everybody is aware of all these things that happened. And we go back to a date where you were not born yet, 1961. There's something happening. Like there is a moment where Lebanon is a kind of great moment for Lebanon, and a kind of promises for a kind of future that has a grand idea. And so that's the moment where Oscar Niemeyer is asked to do that project. So, maybe you want to share a little bit like that grand moment before speaking about a failure.
Yes, of course. Yes, so in 1962, the Ministry of Planning in Lebanon decides to create an exhibition committee in order to start conceiving the idea of an international fairground in Lebanon that would host world expos or international biennale. And one of the major members of this committee was a Lebanese architect, Amadou Chalhoub, who was based in Brazil, or who belonged to the Lebanese diaspora in Brazil. And he proposed Oscar Niemeyer as the chosen architect. And this is before he becomes a star architect, as we know of him today. This was also Niemeyer's first international commission, just to mention. And Niemeyer gets to Lebanon, receives the invitation, gets to Lebanon, conceives the plan for the fairground after visiting Tripoli. And then there's a time frame of almost 5 years before the civil war starts, where they had started building the site, but at the same time, issues related to budget, funding, corruption here and there started reappearing, and this is what slowed kind of the process. But then in 1975, the civil war emerged, and the site was built up until the structures that you see in the film. And then the war lasts until 1991. Throughout the war, the site becomes a weapon base for the Syrian army that was among the many fractions or armies that participated in the Lebanese civil war. So they occupy the site and they take the site as a weapon base, and of course the construction process is put to halt. 1991, war ends. It's Beirut as a city that got affected the most. And so all the efforts are directed towards the rebuilding of Beirut, also because it's the capital. Since this moment, this site has been, let's say, neglected. And so were these structures, or concrete structures. And with time, scientists and local urban planners have assessed them as structures that are threatened to collapse. And so this is the story of the site up until 2022. I'm going to leave the surprise of the UNESCO for later.
But actually, I wanted to ask you about the UNESCO because I found that is a bit paradoxical that somehow the site that was encompassing this kind of grand idea was never really finished, was never used for what it was supposed to be. It was, as you said, occupied by the Syrian army during the civil war, was never really open to the population somehow in a kind of direct use. And so now is becoming a heritage space of that somehow I found paradoxical because as a monument to failure somehow.
Yes. Yeah, so we're going to give some context. 2 weeks ago, the UNESCO officially listed the site as a World Monument Site in danger. And so this nomination is important in the way that it brings attention to the state of precarity that this site is enduring, and it, let's say, officializes the danger in some ways. It really comes as a stamp where it goes like, okay, this site is really about to collapse. We hope that you can do something about it. But also I wanted to mention, as you're speaking, that there's a fundamental problem in Lebanon, and it's mentioned in the film, is that everything, or in many ways, things are looked at from the perspective of public and private sphere, and things get very quickly privatized. Even electricity and water in Lebanon are privatized, and they belong to private sectors. So they're not state fund or government owned. And this is also a major issue that led to where the site, or how the site is navigating the state of precarity right now, is that it is not a public space, and it's privatized, and there's not a consensus within the structure of the Lebanese, within Lebanese politics, to take an active political decision to do something about it. And so the problem also starts from the board itself. There are constant problems with the managing board of the site, but then also the many interests that so many politicians could conceive, saving or not saving the site. Yeah.
I don't know if you have already seen the movie, but I think there is at least for me, a very strong and beautiful beginning where you hear the first voice speaking about this question of collapse and really, kind of summarizing the history of this site as emblematic of the failure of the Lebanese government and so on. And I think what is very beautiful, and I think is something that you use throughout the movie, is that what you see and what you hear are actually not corresponding. And so, but they are related in instigating in your mind a kind of intriguing connection. So there's this sequence that is actually the first time you kind of start to familiarize with the site, that you have all the vertical elements built by Niemeyer, and you only see the top of them. And so you imagine this kind of very elevated structure that are going up, and then the voice is speaking about collapse. And so you really feel the fragility and even the kind of absurdity of building this kind of elevated things in a place that has all these fragilities.
برأيي المشكلة الأساسية بلبنان هي الإهمال بكل القطاعات. وين ما بتطلعي بتشوفي إهمال من جهة الدولة لإدارتها للبلد. هيدا الإهمال بيؤدي بالنهاية لكارثة، وصارت السياسة بلبنان هي إدارة كوارث. وكيف بينداروا هيدي الكوارث؟ الإدمان على الدين. نتطلع لبرا لحدا يبعت مصاري لحتى ينقذنا من الكارثة يلي سببناها نحن من وراء الإهمال للمشكلة يلي شفناها عم بتصير. القطاع المصرفي والاقتصاد هن يعني مثل كتير واضح لهيدا الشيء. يعني لمدة 20-30 سنة هيدا الهيكل الاقتصادي كان عم يفرط، وأي حدا عم يطلع عليه شايفه شوي عم يفرط، بس ما ينعمل شيء لحتى نصلحه. لا حتى بالآخر النهار ونحن عم نعيش هلأ يمكن تاني أو ثالث أكبر كارثة اقتصادية بآخر 150 سنة بالعالم. هيدا شيء ما بيصير بين يوم والتاني. هيدا شيء يعني بياخد مثل اكتيف إهمال، لأنه بدك تضلك تشوفي، بدك يعني إذا بدك تشوفي البناية عم تفرط، وبدل ما تخليها تفرط بدك تشوفي وين فيني لزق هون ولزق هونيك، لحتى بالآخر بس تهبط. هيدي الكارثة بتكون أكبر بكتير من لو أنت تركتيها وما عملت شيء أصلاً. وبعتقد نفس الشيء بالمعرض بطرابلس. يعني نحن بنسمع بنايات بتهبط بطرابلس كل شهر، يمكن في بناية.
This is Mike Azar. He's an economist specialist, currently based in Lebanon, and he's one of the major 4 interviewers in the film that I spoke with. And the point or my interest here was really to parallel this idea of collapse with the collapse of the currency, of the Lebanese currency right now, that is generated due to the economic crisis that he describes, or that even the World Bank describes as being one of the worst economic crises in the 21st century. This is one of the 4 voices in the film. The second voice is Abir Sa'sou, who's a local urban planner, and who has extensively done work on the periphery of the site and how the site impacts the city on an urban planning scale. And she offers interesting critique and insight on the way we glorify modernism and, let's say, the romanticism that comes with wanting to step into modernism when the site was first conceived in 1960, because it also came with Lebanon perceiving itself as this nation would really want to put forward an image of itself that is very much tied to progress. And so we looked at Oscar Niemeyer, or at this site, as being the stamp of progress that we could give to ourselves, and therefore that would impact our image to the world. And so this is also a question. I think that both I and the CCA were interested in how architecture is instrumentalized in order to satisfy some sort of aspirations when it comes to nation building. And the third voice is Mohamed Tartousi, who is a young photojournalist who was very active in the 2019 protests / the revolution. And his narrative is interesting in ways where he goes from being bored, that's why he started going to the protest, to going to the protest and then being bored again, because the protest didn't end up satisfying the result that we all wanted to reach. And the fourth voice is Rania Rafi, who is a filmmaker from Tripoli, and she's also a friend, and she was telling me about a film that she wanted to make, or that she was making in Tripoli, about Tripoli going through the apocalypse, or an apocalyptic event happening in Tripoli. And at some point, I instigate some of her motifs around this idea of the apocalypse, the city, because I also feel that there are some parallels when it comes to the concept of collapse in that sense.
Yeah, my question is somehow talking about collapse, but also talking about one of the powerful gesture that you're doing through the film, so constructing this duality between the site and the margins, what is happening around, what is happening along the edges. I was wondering if you can tell us more about this sort of a kind of moves that you make during the film, which is also constructed through the evidence, the technological kind of cinematographic evidence of using two typologies of cameras.
Yes.
And what is constructing for you this sort of a kind of a movement?
Mm-hmm. So first, I would like to credit the cinematographer behind this film, William Albu, who's with us tonight. And so with William, we started thinking first around how we wanted to frame the site, and to really encapsulate these huge structures in a cinema frame, which wasn't necessarily the easiest task. Because we also wanted to deconstruct the way the site has been filmed in the past by other, let's say, artists, or even just photojournalists and such. And it always goes back to glorifying these huge structures within the framing and the composition of the images. And we really wanted to take a step back from this kind of cinematography or framing and composition, and portray these structures as being somehow alien structures, because this is how they appear to be in the city of Tripoli. And this is how I think we wanted to go back and forth between the site and the city in order to replicate this feeling of alienation. And I feel like with this decision, I do want people to ask themselves or to question, is this site even part of Lebanon? Tellement que it does not look Lebanese in that sense, or like even if it's modernist, it has been criticized as being lacking some sort of understanding about the landscape that it transplanted itself into. And so from here comes the back and forth between 16mm as a medium and digital. And so everything, all the sites, all the site footage is in 60 millimeter, and all the city footage is in digital. And I mean, there are also other decisions or other motifs, let's say, that inspired this decision, thinking around the notion of time and how 16 was the medium that was used in the time when the site was constructed, and this idea of wanting to situate it within the present moment, therefore its conversation with the digital.
Yeah, and so going back again to this question about the site and the city, and this question of time, I also find that it's fascinating in the movie how you see the site kind of empty and sort of like is just the architecture there, and then you have the city and you have, you know, the kind of life of the people there, but there it's interesting because the site seems having lasted through time, and actually the speed of the city seems also, as there is no hurry to go through time. I don't know, like it's maybe also the scene you decided to document, but there is this sort of like time question that I think it also comes out. And at one point you feel absorbed. If you will see all the entire movie, you feel absorbed and you don't know anymore for how long you have seen the movie, because you also kind of lose track of time.
It just also reminded me about your idea earlier about the interviews not being synced with the image. And yes, this was an intentional decision since the beginning, mostly because I think we wanted to make a film that allows for contemplation and contemplation in order to reflect on the many stakes that are discussed in the film, from the crisis to the precarity of the site, to the collapse of the currency. I think that the fact that the images fall more as poetic tableaux and are not necessarily synced with the information is something that also, I think, in that sense, we tried to deconstruct the way we think of documentary. And so, for example, there's not a single talking head in the whole film. And even the interviewees, I just described to you what their status and role is, but you wouldn't necessarily have known this as you're just simply hearing the information that you're being provided with. But then this idea of picturing it being empty, I mean, it's also its reality right now. People get filtered by being given access card based on their social status, which is, again, goes back to this idea of the fact that it's privatized and it's not a public space. And at the end, there's the karting scene with the cars. This is the periphery of the site. And so the periphery of the site that is not fenced is what is appropriated by most people for different uses. And that's also the scene on which the film ends, because we're really trying to situate the site within the city and how it speaks, but sometimes it doesn't speak to the city, and there's this constant conflict of existence. I think that the city experience towards the site and that the site experience towards the city.
Yeah, I think this afternoon we're talking about, because it would be interesting to know more how you picked, some of these fragments of lives that are the selection of these narratives which are happening around. And you were telling us this afternoon there are some stories, like, for example, the images of the small ships that are going along the coast, and what is the value and what is the meaning that you gave to the different scenes that are happening around.
There are definitely some scenes from the city that have their roots in stories that we don't necessarily hear about in the film. So, for example, there's different scenes of ferries in the sea leaving the coast of Tripoli. This is mostly because some tourists just want to go see the islands, because Tripoli has many islands. But in my personal reference, it was a reference to an event that happened a week before we go shoot the film, where a family tried to escape by the sea through using a boat because of they're fed up from the situation in Lebanon, and the family just drowned and they couldn't save them. And there's also a burnt building where also we see employees leaving this building, but it's burnt, so it looks dysfunctional, but employees are still coming in. And this is the municipality building, which was entirely burnt during the 2019 protests. Yet employees are still going in. But at the same time, for me, it's a way to visually represent the dysfunctionality of the bureaucracy that shapes us, or let's say the bureaucratic infrastructure that we are circulating around in Tripoli right now. What other? Yeah, and the conversation around the phenomenon of building collapsing in Tripoli. That's also, it was a recent, not recent, but I decided to really interview Abir at some point about it, because also 2 weeks before we start shooting, there's a building that collapsed in Tripoli on its inhabitants. And she explains how the way the rehabilitation guidelines are so rigid that it's almost impossible to have a building be saved. And in that regard, it goes in parallel with saving the site and it being threatened by collapse, and us wanting to figure out rehabilitation and conservation management plans that don't end up necessarily succeeding after discussions.
So I don't know if you have other questions, Giovanna. I think we can also start to kind of open to the floor if there are points, comments, questions.
Yes, do you, or maybe one of the interviewees, add some thoughts about what could be a new use, a different use of the site? Was this mentioned in your conversations? And thinking about the new heritage status that was declared, do you personally think that actually reviving the site is the way to go, or maybe it's a wrong way to think about it, to see it as neglected, just needing to be architecturally revived, or do the urban planner you mentioned maybe offered another interesting use that could be offered?
Yeah, I will answer the second question just because it's an important point, because there has been constant proposals of what we can do with this site, and some of them come in a more unrealistic way than how this site was conceived for Tripoli in terms of scale. And so again, it goes back to the absence of a political move and decision towards the site, and to adopt one of the plans that get proposed. But then at the same time, I think that the question goes beyond this, and Abir really poses interesting questions in terms of what do we really want from the site, and how can the site serve Tripoli in terms of what it needs right now, and what can Tripoli offer to these monumental structures in reverse. So I think this is where the gap is that this conversation or these questions are not being taken to far enough constructively to be able to conceive something that can, let's say, save the site in a way that becomes functional.
I would like to understand, you were saying that you have to get an accreditation to visit the site. It's privatized. Can the public see it at all or not at all, and why?
Yeah, you have to say there are so many scenarios that have been built in terms of how we can access the site. So one of them is that you can say that you're a tourist and you will get instant access. The other one is that you can say you're from Beirut and you can get access because in their head you've traveled far enough to come to Tripoli to access the site. And then in terms of the accreditation, yes, it's a paid access card, which as a gesture filters out people and doesn't allow for some to pay for it and for others to pay for it. Yeah. Why? It's just a thing. It's because it's privatized, and this is a policy that the board has set up. And maybe it's important to mention that in Niemeyer's original plan, there were no fences surrounding the site, and it's the Lebanese government that called for the building of the fences, and he was not necessarily in agreement with this decision, but they still did it.
Yeah, I was wondering, Francesco was talking earlier about the CCA using more and more the film as a curatorial tool, and I was wondering, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with your previous work, but as a video artist or filmmaker, but I was wondering how, if it changed something for you, like how this perspective of seeing the movie as a curatorial tool changed or did not change your gaze in this project, and how did it influence your work being here in the museum and research environment with all those people?
Very curious to know.
Yes. Yes, I mean, since the beginning, or since the initial proposal, the film, in terms of structure, didn't change much. But what changed is the end result. So at the beginning, it was supposed to be just the film, and then the idea of creating an exhibition around it emerged. And I think that this is the interesting dialogue that both me and CCA entered in terms of thinking around the narrative in this film and how it gets constructed, because there is really a lot to talk about when it comes to the site, and there's some archive that exists, not so many, but some, that is in part on display in the octagonal. But then again, the fact that we knew that there was going to be an exhibition and that the film was going to coexist with this exhibition really shaped the way we curate the context that we want to provide, first in the film and then second, or maybe both first, in parallel, the exhibition and the film. And I think that I did rely in that process on the exhibition to not provide some things because I knew that they were going to exist in the exhibition. And I think the exhibition was thought in the same mindset, where it also didn't provide specific things because we knew that the film was going to be the main museum object. And I think this is where the things become really exciting and interesting, to think about curation not only within the notion of exhibition making, but also filmmaking, and how you structure your film curatorially while working within such institution, I think.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was super interesting. I find it very interesting how you talk about architecture being used as a tool to create this national identity, which is very common in Lebanon. And many of these modernist buildings that were built before the war ended up being failures and then being appropriated by the people as a form of revolution against the government. So it's funny how they were meant to be used to glorify the country, and then they end up being used against it. So I was wondering, I don't know if the fair was used during the revolution in 2019, or was it not accessible? Because many buildings in Beirut ended up being appropriated by the population as a space for revolution. So I'm curious to know if the space was used.
Yes, it was appropriated in very few days, or throughout very few days, where, like, if we have witnessed the way things happened in Tripoli during the 2019 revolution, things were very intense. The streets were very, very much filled. And yeah, one day protesters occupied the fair and really entered inside the fair as a way to expand the spaces that they occupy in order to call for that change. Yeah, and another incident that happened few days ago was the earthquake in Turkey, and it hit Lebanon in a very minimalist way, if I can put it this way. So it was not as intense as it was in Turkey and Syria, but I was told that the fairground was used, because it's an open space, it was used as a space for people who were leaving their homes while the earthquake was happening, to find refuge in it, because it's an open space.
I'm really interested in your approach to archives through a fictional lens, and I'm wondering, does fictional approach to history and more like imaginative approach to history, how does that influence your documentary making, and how do you see the historical and the virtual and the imaginative or composited in a film?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think that, I mean, in this project, or even maybe in other projects, the use of fiction, or the way I see it, comes from wanting to offer a counter narrative, or to, let's say, fill a gap that was generated due to a lack of account. So, for example, this site has not been really scholarly accounted on. Niemeyer doesn't talk about in his interviews and memoir. It is not really mentioned in books that try to study the legacy and the work of Niemeyer. And so the reason why the film opens with the sequence of the black and white photo archive that showcase the construction of the site is to try to offer a narrative that is missing, because I couldn't find it really anywhere. But in these images and in these photos, there was also a conversation to include a narration that gives more context on the site. but then I decided to not move forward with this context, because I think that these images, and in the way cinema works in terms of also the function of editing, also editor of the film, Kyla Fragman, is here tonight, really helps or really allow us to have the images speak on the context that they are trying to provide. And this is, I think, where, the motifs of proposing this sequence as being the first sequence came from. I hope this answers your question.
And also you're using a specific soundscape also to kind of enhance or kind of work with this idea of the fiction in a way?
Yes, sound designer Antoine Bédard is also with us tonight. Yes, because this film was made half Lebanese crew and half Montreal crew. So I'm really happy that some of the crew is here.
Maybe we take another couple of questions and then we can keep him. Oh, there's already another.
I want to start saying that I appreciated this poetical statement on the bureaucratic failure that is Lebanon. I think that it's very well done. About the film, you started saying that it's been land that was nationalized from orchids at the beginning. So it was part of an ideal plan for the government. But then today it's privatized, from what I understand, and there's a non-functional board, so that's why all the projects are failing and all the neglect is coming from there. But do we know who is this private board, and who are these owners that are taking these huge decisions, because it's a huge plot of land in the city of Tripoli?
Yes, so the land on which the site used to be a field of orange blossom trees, which is also a postcard that can be identifiable in the octagonal gallery, framed. And so there's that. And then the board are the politicians that circulate around a corrupt structure. And this is why the board, even though usually we count on boards to save some institutions or some places, in the case of the site, the board is not, the managing board is barely reliable. They are themselves also the ones that own it, and the politicians, and it's all tied together.
Thank you very much for this very interesting work. And I've never been to Lebanon, but I certainly experienced Tripoli as this melancholy protagonist of a character as a city. And I wondered whether you were continuing to explore these themes in future work. Like, what are you thinking of doing now? Because I certainly imagined that more a series of films on a set of themes that clearly center in this work that you've created. So are you continuing with these themes? Because I think it could be a podcast as well, like a series of films, producing a series of films there. Thank you.
No, I mean, thank you for the question. Since the emergence of the current socio-economic crisis in Lebanon in 2019, I became really interested in wanting to explore ways to not just tackle it, but to visualize it. Like, how do you visualize such states of precarity? And my answer, making this film, was by looking at architecture as it parallels the same state. But I would say that, or to answer briefly, the Lebanese crisis and the way it's been unfolding and the infrastructure of the economic system is something that I'm interested in, and that will probably shape some of my next projects as well. For the film, I think CCA is looking forward to submit it to festivals, and we will hope that it will screen outside of Montreal.
Yeah, well, the film will be, is part of the exhibition in our Octagonal Gallery until end of May. So this is, will be the site where to kind of watch it. And then, yes, as Joyce mentioned, is always part of our strategy, then of distributing, the cinematographic contents we produce. So we will keep you posted. And
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.